In Westminster Hall on June 22, 1772, a judge prepared to announce a decision that would send shockwaves across the Atlantic world. Standing before him was a man who had been born free in West Africa, captured as a child, sold into bondage in Virginia, and now, after daring to escape his chains in London, faced being shipped to the brutal sugar plantations of Jamaica. The question before Lord Mansfield wasn't just about one man's freedom. It was about whether the very air of England could tolerate slavery within its borders. We know him today as James Somerset, though that probably wasn't the name his mother gave him when he was born somewhere in West Africa around 1741. Like millions of other Africans stolen from their homelands, his original identity was erased, replaced with a name convenient for those who claimed to own him. But Somerset would become famous, his case a landmark moment in the long struggle against slavery. This is the story of how one man's fight for freedom forced England to confront the profound contradiction at the heart of its empire. Somerset was about 8 years old when slavers captured him, somewhere in the vast interior of West Africa. We don't know the details of his capture, whether he was taken in a raid, sold by enemies of his community, or kidnapped by coastal traders. What we do know is that he was sold to European slave traders who transported him to the horrific holding pens on the African coast, where captives were imprisoned before being forced onto slave ships. On March 10, 1749, Somerset was loaded onto a British slave ship bound for the American colonies. He was just a child, torn from everything and everyone he knew, crammed into the suffocating darkness of a ship's hold with hundreds of other captives. Many wouldn't survive the voyage across the Atlantic, succumbing to disease, brutality, or despair. Somerset made it to Virginia alive, but what awaited him there was a lifetime of bondage. On August 1, 1749, a Scottish merchant named Charles Stuart purchased Somerset in Virginia. Stuart had emigrated from Scotland to the colonies around 1741, initially working as a storekeeper for a Glasgow tobacco merchant. By the time he bought Somerset, Stuart had established himself as a successful merchant in Norfolk, Virginia, deeply involved in the tobacco trade that depended entirely on enslaved labor. Stuart was just one of thousands of colonists who built their prosperity on the backs of enslaved Africans. But he was ambitious, and his colonial career was only beginning. For Somerset, being purchased by Stuart meant being transplanted into the brutal world of Virginia slavery. The colony's entire economy ran on tobacco, and tobacco cultivation required armies of enslaved workers who labored from dawn until dark in the fields. Virginia had developed one of North America's most rigid and comprehensive slave codes, a legal framework that defined enslaved people as property, denied them any legal rights, and prescribed harsh punishments for resistance. Somerset spent his childhood and early adulthood enslaved in Virginia, serving Stuart in what appears to have been primarily a domestic role. Norfolk was a busy port town, and Stuart's merchant business meant Somerset would have been exposed to the constant movement of ships, goods, and people through the colonial trade networks. For 20 years, from 1749 to 1769, Somerset lived in this world. We don't have detailed records of his daily life during these decades, but we can infer some things from the broader patterns of slavery in colonial Virginia. Enslaved people in domestic service often had slightly better material conditions than field workers, more varied diets, better clothing, closer proximity to their enslavers. But these relative advantages came with their own torments. Domestic slaves lived under constant surveillance, subjected to the whims and moods of their owners at every moment. There was no privacy, no refuge, no sphere of life that belonged to them alone. In 1764, Stuart's fortunes rose when he was appointed Receiver General of Customs in Boston, a position that gave him authority over collecting import duties and enforcing increasingly unpopular British trade regulations in the Massachusetts colony. This was right at the moment when colonial resistance to British taxation was beginning to intensify. Stuart took Somerset with him to Boston, where they remained for 5 years as tensions between the colonies and the mother country escalated. Boston in the 1760s was becoming a hotbed of revolutionary ferment. Stuart, as a customs official, found himself on the front lines of enforcing the Stamp Act and the Townshend duties, the very taxes that were pushing American colonists toward rebellion. The city saw protests, riots, and the growing organization of colonial resistance. For Somerset, Boston meant exposure to a different environment than Virginia, a northern port city where slavery existed but was less central to the economy, where there were free black people, and where anti-slavery sentiment, though still marginal, had begun to take root among some Quakers and other religious groups. In November 1769, Stuart made a decision that would ultimately lead to the courtroom drama that made Somerset famous. He decided to relocate to London, and he took Somerset with him. Stuart had family obligations in England. His sister Cecilia had recently been widowed, and he wanted to support her and her family. But he also had business interests to pursue in the imperial capital. Stuart was wealthy enough to dress Somerset in fine clothes and bring him to business meetings, using him as a status symbol. In the 18th century, it was fashionable among wealthy English people to have black servants. They were seen as exotic adornments to a household, proof of one's connection to the empire and the luxury it generated. London had a substantial black population by 1772, somewhere between 10,000 and 15,000 people of African descent living in England, most of them in domestic service to wealthy families. Somerset would have encountered other black Londoners in the course of his duties, running errands for Stuart through the city streets, traveling into the English countryside on his master's business. These encounters would prove crucial. In London, Somerset's world began to expand in ways that must have been both exciting and terrifying. The city was the beating heart of the British Empire, a place of immense wealth built substantially on the profits of slavery, but also a place where that very system was beginning to face serious intellectual and moral challenges. Enlightenment ideas about natural rights and human equality were circulating among educated Londoners. Religious groups, particularly Quakers, were questioning whether Christians could justify enslaving other human beings. And there were people, white abolitionists and free black activists, who were actively working to challenge slavery's legal foundations. At some point during his time in London, Somerset came into contact with these ideas and these people. On February 10, 1771, Somerset was baptized at the Church of St. Andrew in Holborn. 3 people stood as his godparents: Thomas Walken, Elizabeth Cade, and John Marlowe. All 3 were abolitionists. This baptism was significant in multiple ways. Christianity had long been used to justify slavery, but there was also a persistent belief that baptism might confer freedom. Back in 1729, the Attorney General Philip York and the Solicitor General Charles Talbot had issued an opinion specifically rejecting this idea, stating that baptism did nothing to change an enslaved person's legal status. But the belief persisted among enslaved people that there was something liberating about becoming a Christian in England. Whether it was this belief, or his contact with abolitionist godparents, or simply the accumulated weight of a lifetime of bondage, Somerset made a decision that changed everything. On October 1st, 1771, he left Stuart's residence and refused to return. After more than 20 years in chains, Somerset had decided to risk everything for freedom. For nearly 2 months, Somerset lived free in London. We don't know exactly where he stayed or how he supported himself, but we can imagine the constant fear he must have felt, knowing that Stuart would be searching for him, knowing that recapture meant not just a return to slavery, but punishment, and quite possibly being sold to the brutal plantation system in the Caribbean. Stuart was indeed searching. He placed advertisements offering a reward for Somerset's capture, describing him as a runaway slave who belonged to him. These notices would have been posted around London, read aloud in taverns and coffeehouses, offering money to anyone who could return Stuart's property. On November 26, 771, Stuart's search ended. Somerset was captured. But Stuart didn't just want to re-enslave Somerset in London. He wanted to make an example of him, and, more importantly, he wanted to remove Somerset from England where abolitionist sympathizers might interfere. Stuart had Somerset imprisoned aboard a ship called the Anne and Mary, captained by John Knowles, which was preparing to sail for Jamaica. Once in Jamaica, Somerset would be sold to a sugar plantation, quite possibly a death sentence. The Caribbean sugar islands had a horrific reputation. Plantations where enslaved people died from overwork and disease at appalling rates and were simply replaced by fresh captives from Africa. Enslaved people in the Caribbean had much shorter life expectancies than those in North America. The work was more brutal, the climate more deadly, the treatment even more vicious. This is what awaited Somerset if that ship sailed. But Somerset had 3 godparents who had pledged in his baptism ceremony to support and protect him, and they took that pledge seriously. Just 2 days after Somerset's capture, on November 28th, Walken, Cade, and Marlowe applied to the Court of King's Bench for a writ of habeas corpus. This was a legal mechanism, ancient in English law, that protected people from arbitrary imprisonment. Habeas corpus literally means you have the body, and it required anyone holding someone prisoner to bring that person before a judge and justify why they were being detained. It was a fundamental right of English subjects, a bulwark against tyranny. Somerset's godparents were making a bold claim that this right applied even to an enslaved African. Captain Knowles complied with the writ. On December 9, 1771, he brought Somerset before the Court of King's Bench. The Chief Justice who would hear the case was William Murray, known as Lord Mansfield, and Somerset found another crucial ally, Granville Sharp. Sharp was already famous in abolitionist circles. Born in Durham in 1735 into a well-educated family, Sharp had started out as an apprentice to a London draper before entering government service in the Ordnance Department. But his real passion became the study of law and the fight against slavery. Sharp's involvement in the anti-slavery cause had begun years earlier, when he encountered a severely beaten enslaved man named Jonathan Strong. Sharp had helped Strong win his freedom in court, and he'd been pursuing similar cases ever since, systematically building a legal argument that slavery had no foundation in English law. Sharp hadn't just taken on individual cases, he'd published treatises attacking slavery. In 1769, he published a representation of the injustice and dangerous tendency of tolerating slavery, the first tract published in England to explicitly attack the entire concept of slavery. Sharp saw Somerset's case as potentially the test case he'd been waiting for, an opportunity to force the English courts to confront slavery's legal status directly. Sharp wasn't Somerset's lawyer. Somerset was represented by a team of 5 barristers who would argue his case, but Sharp was the strategist and financial backer behind the scenes. He had studied English law intensively, and he briefed Somerset's legal team on the arguments he believed could win. The lead lawyer was John Glynn, a sitting member of Parliament for Middlesex. He was joined by Francis Hargrave, a young lawyer making his very first court appearance. This case would establish his reputation. The team also included William Davy, John Alline, and James Mansfield. All 5 agreed to work pro bono. Their services were free, paid for by public subscriptions from people who supported the cause. It's worth pausing here to appreciate how unusual this was. Legal representation was expensive, and enslaved people typically had no access to lawyers. But Somerset's case had captured public attention, and supporters sent money to fund the defense. Opposing Somerset was Stuart's legal team, led by John Dunning, also a sitting MP, and William Wallace. Their services were funded by West Indian plantation owners who had everything to lose if the court ruled against slavery. The case was originally scheduled for a hearing on January 21, 1772, but Lord Mansfield granted Somerset's team additional time to prepare their arguments, so the actual proceedings didn't begin until February 7th. From the start, it was clear this case transcended one man's freedom. Crowds flocked to Westminster Hall to hear the arguments. Newspapers covered every session. Black Londoners sent representatives to monitor the proceedings, and afterward they would meet near Charing Cross to organize and discuss strategy. This wasn't just legal theater. The outcome would have profound implications for the estimated 15,000 black people living in England. Somerset's lawyers made several key arguments. First, they argued that English common law did not recognize slavery. They pointed to the expiration of villeinage, the medieval system of serfdom that had been the closest thing England had to slavery, which had died out during the Tudor period. Since then, they argued, no positive law, no Act of Parliament, had established slavery in England. Stuart's claim to own Somerset derived from Virginia law, but Virginia law did not apply in England. English law governed what happened on English soil, and English law, they argued, did not permit one person to own another as property. Second, they attacked the very idea that Somerset could be bound to Stuart by contract. Contract law required that both parties freely consent to the agreement. How could Somerset have consented to being enslaved? He had been captured as a child, transported across the Atlantic against his will, sold like livestock. There was no contract, there was only violence and coercion. Third, they made a broader moral argument. Francis Hargrave, despite his youth and inexperience, delivered passionate arguments that the question before the court wasn't whether slavery was legal in the colonies, which wasn't for English courts to decide, but whether slavery could exist in England itself. He appealed to English traditions of liberty, suggesting that permitting slavery on English soil would corrupt those traditions. Stuart's lawyers countered with arguments about property rights and economic necessity. John Dunning argued that property rights must be paramount. Stuart had legally purchased Somerset in Virginia under Virginia law. Somerset was his property, and property rights must be respected wherever the property holder travels. To rule otherwise, Dunning argued, would be to undermine property rights in general, opening the door to chaos and disorder. William Wallace emphasized the economic stakes. If the court freed Somerset, what would happen to the thousands of other enslaved people in England? What about the West Indian planters who relied on enslaved labor? The Caribbean colonies produced enormous wealth for Britain: sugar, rum, and other commodities that flowed through British ports and filled British coffers. The whole system depended on enslaved labor. Wallace presented calculations suggesting that freeing enslaved people in England alone would cost slave owners more than £700,000 sterling. And what about the empire's broader slave economy? The argument was essentially that slavery was too profitable to challenge. Lord Mansfield found himself in an impossible position. He was a brilliant jurist, widely respected for his legal mind, but this case forced him to choose between law and economics, between justice and empire. Mansfield was no radical. He lived at Kenwood House on Hampstead Heath with his wife and two great-nieces, one of whom was Dido Bell, the mixed-race daughter of his nephew and an enslaved African woman. Dido's presence in his household makes Mansfield's position even more complex. He lived daily with a reminder of slavery's human reality. But Mansfield also understood the enormous economic interests at stake. He clearly wished the case would simply go away. During the proceedings, he tried repeatedly to convince the parties to settle out of court. He suggested to Stuart that he should just free Somerset and drop the case, avoiding a potentially controversial ruling. Stuart, backed by the West Indian planters, refused. Mansfield even tried to convince Somerset's godmother Elizabeth Cade to purchase Somerset from Stuart and then free him, but she refused on principle, believing that paying Stuart would be conceding that he had a right to own Somerset in the first place. The hearings stretched from February into May, with 3 separate sessions as Mansfield delayed and deliberated. He made clear that he wanted to rule as narrowly as possible to avoid addressing the broader question of slavery's legality. On May 14th, Mansfield made one final attempt to avoid ruling. He told the parties that if they insisted on a judgment, he would give one, and he would let justice be done whatever the consequences. Fiat justia ruat coelum. Let justice be done though the heavens fall. It was both a warning and a plea. Stuart, again, refused to back down. So Mansfield retired to prepare his decision. For more than a month, the country waited. On June 22, 1772, Mansfield delivered his judgment. The courtroom was packed. Mansfield read from a carefully prepared written statement, guarded, cautious, and concise. He acknowledged the legal opinions from 1729 that had stated slavery was permissible in England, but he also made clear that his decision would rest on a narrower question. He framed the issue as whether any dominion, authority, or coercion can be exercised in this country on a slave according to American laws. He concluded that such dominion could not. And then came the words that would echo through history. The state of slavery is of such a nature that it is incapable of being introduced on any reasons, moral or political, but only positive law, which preserves its force long after the reasons, occasion, and time itself from whence it was created, is erased from memory. It is so odious that nothing can be suffered to support it, but positive law. Whatever inconveniences, therefore, may follow from the decision, I cannot say this case is allowed or approved by the law of England, and therefore the black must be discharged. James Somerset was free. The courtroom erupted. Mansfield had tried to limit his ruling. He was technically deciding only that Stuart couldn't forcibly remove Somerset from England to be sold abroad, but the language he used was far more sweeping. He had called slavery odious. He had said it could only exist if Parliament explicitly authorized it, and Parliament hadn't. Many people, including Somerset himself, understood the ruling to mean that slavery was illegal in England. 5 days after the ruling, on June 27, 1702, the Public Advertiser reported that nearly 200 black Londoners held a celebration at a public house in Westminster to mark Somerset's triumph. They paid 5 shillings each for tickets, a considerable sum, to celebrate what they understood as their collective freedom. There was music, food, toasts to Somerset, and to liberty. For these black Londoners, Mansfield's ruling meant they were free. The decision sent shock waves through the empire. Colonial newspapers reported extensively on the case, and the reactions revealed how deeply slavery had become entwined with colonial economics and identity. In Virginia, in South Carolina, in Jamaica, slave owners read Mansfield's words with alarm. If England wouldn't tolerate slavery on its own soil, what did that say about the empire's commitment to protecting slavery in the colonies? The Somerset case became one more grievance that pushed Southern colonists toward the patriot cause in the looming American Revolution. They feared that British reformers might extend their anti-slavery principles to the colonies themselves. Some historians argue that the fear of losing their enslaved property helped drive Southern planters into rebellion. At the same time, the Somerset decision had the opposite effect on many enslaved people and free black people in the colonies. If England wouldn't enforce slavery, perhaps England might be a refuge. When the Revolutionary War erupted in 1775, significant numbers of enslaved people sought freedom with the British forces, responding to British offers of freedom in exchange for military service. The Somerset case had helped plant the idea that the British Crown might be more sympathetic to black freedom than the American patriots were. But did the Somerset case actually end slavery in England? The answer is complicated and sobering. Mansfield himself later clarified that his ruling was narrow. In a case 13 years later, in 1785, he stated explicitly that his Somerset decision went no further than that the master cannot by force compel him to go out of the kingdom. That was it. The ruling didn't free all enslaved people in England. It didn't even definitively establish that enslaved people automatically became free by setting foot in England. It simply said that they couldn't be forcibly removed from England to be sold abroad. In practice, even this narrow ruling wasn't consistently enforced. Just a year after Somerset's victory, the London Chronicle reported that an enslaved African man shot himself to avoid being transported back to the colonies. The horror of that moment, choosing death over re-enslavement, reveals that the threat of being recaptured and shipped abroad remained very real. As late as 1823, more than 50 years after the Somerset case, a woman named Grace Jones was forcibly removed from England to Antigua by her mistress. The ruling hadn't ended the practice it supposedly prohibited. Enslaved people continued to be bought and sold in England even after the Somerset case. In 1779, a Liverpool newspaper advertised the sale of a black boy, and Granville Sharp kept a clipping of the advertisement as proof that the battle was far from over. In 1788, anti-slavery campaigners, including Thomas Clarkson, bought an enslaved person in England specifically to demonstrate that slavery still existed in the country. The Somerset case hadn't abolished slavery in England, but it had done something perhaps equally important. It had established a principle, however imperfectly applied, that slavery was odious and contrary to English law. That principle became a powerful tool for abolitionists. It helped shift the moral terrain, making slavery something that required justification rather than something that could be taken for granted. The case also inspired other freedom suits. A man named Mr. Dublin escaped from his enslaver John Riddell in Bristol Wells, telling his fellow servants that he had received a letter from his uncle Somerset acquainting him that Lord Mansfield had given them their freedom and he was determined to leave. Whether Dublin was actually related to Somerset or whether this was a convenient story we don't know, but it shows how Somerset's name had become synonymous with freedom. In Scotland, which had its own separate legal system, an enslaved man named Joseph Knight read about the Somerset case in the Edinburgh Advertiser and claimed his freedom. His case went to court, and in Saint-Denis, Scottish judges ruled that one could not be a slave under Scots law. The Somerset precedent was spreading. What happened to James Somerset after his moment in the spotlight? The truth is, we don't know. The last documentary evidence we have of Somerset is from July 1772, less than a month after the ruling. A letter from a friend of Charles Stuart's mentions that a man named Dublin had run away, telling servants he'd received a letter from his uncle Somerset. That's it. After July 1772, James Somerset disappears from the historical record. We don't know if he lived a long life or died young. We don't know if he found meaningful work or struggled in poverty. We don't know if he stayed in London or moved elsewhere. We don't know if he ever tried to contact family in West Africa or if he started a family in England. He simply vanishes. This absence is itself telling. Somerset mattered to history as a legal symbol, a name in a court case, but he didn't matter enough to the people keeping records for them to track what happened to him once his usefulness to the abolitionist cause had ended. He was a man who had endured capture, enslavement, and separation from everyone he loved, who had risked everything for freedom and won. And then he faded into the anonymity that was the lot of most free black people in Georgian England. What we can trace is the legacy of his case. The Somerset decision became a founding text for the abolitionist movement. Granville Sharp continued his crusade against slavery, founding the Society for Effecting the Abolition of the Slave Trade in 1787, along with Thomas Clarkson. They were later joined by William Wilberforce, who led the parliamentary campaign against the slave trade. The abolitionist movement grew slowly but steadily, building public opinion against slavery, organizing boycotts of slave-produced sugar, collecting thousands of signatures on anti-slavery petitions. In 1807, 35 years after Somerset's case, Parliament passed the Slave Trade Act, prohibiting British ships from transporting enslaved Africans. This didn't free anyone already enslaved, but it was a major step. Finally, in 1833, Parliament passed the Slavery Abolition Act, which freed enslaved people throughout most of the British Empire. It took 61 years from Somerset's case to general emancipation, and even then, Britain compensated slave owners for their losses, while the formerly enslaved received nothing. The Somerset case was cited by abolitionists throughout this long struggle. The principle that Mansfield had articulated, that slavery was so odious it required explicit legal sanction, became a powerful weapon. It allowed abolitionists to argue that slavery was an aberration, something foreign to English legal traditions, something that corrupted the liberties that English people prided themselves on. Of course, this was always somewhat dishonest. England had been deeply involved in the Atlantic slave trade for centuries. British ships transported more than 3 million enslaved Africans across the Atlantic. British capital financed plantations. British merchants grew wealthy on slave-produced commodities. British consumers enjoyed cheap sugar and rum produced by enslaved labor. Slavery wasn't foreign to England, It was fundamental to the prosperity that England enjoyed in the 18th century. But the Somerset case allowed abolitionists to create a narrative in which slavery was something that happened elsewhere, in the colonies, while England itself remained pure. This narrative was politically useful, even if historically questionable. The Somerset case also resonated in America, though in more complicated ways. Abolitionists in the northern states cited it as evidence that slavery was contrary to natural law and civilized legal systems. Frederick Douglass, Harriet Beecher Stowe, and other anti-slavery writers invoked Somerset's case and quoted from the legal arguments made on his behalf. But the case also hardened the determination of Southern slave owners to resist any interference with slavery. The contradiction was stark. How could Britain claim moral superiority by restricting slavery at home, while British colonies in the Caribbean remained slave societies? How could America's northern states cite British precedents against slavery, while the British Empire still profited enormously from slavery? These contradictions fueled debates about slavery's morality and legality that would ultimately contribute to the American Civil War. The way we remember the Somerset case today reflects our ongoing struggles with how to understand the history of slavery and abolition. For a long time, the case was celebrated as the moment Britain abolished slavery, a narrative that fit comfortably with British national mythology about being a force for freedom in the world. But more recent scholarship has emphasized how limited the ruling actually was, how it didn't end slavery even in England, how it coexisted with Britain's massive, ongoing involvement in the slave trade and colonial slavery. Some scholars argue that we've given Somerset's case too much credit, that we've focused on legal decisions made by elite white men while ignoring the much more important work of enslaved people who resisted, rebelled, and escaped. There's truth in that critique. The Somerset case wouldn't have happened without James Somerset's courage in escaping, without his godparents' determination to protect him, without the broader community of black Londoners who supported his case. And one court case, however celebrated, changed far less than the accumulated weight of slave resistance, abolitionist organizing, economic transformation, and political pressure over decades. But there's also something powerful in Somerset's story, precisely because it reveals the contradictions at the heart of empire. Here was a man who embodied everything empire tried to deny. That enslaved people were thinking, feeling human beings who understood their own oppression, and who would risk everything to escape it. Here was a case that forced Britain's highest court to acknowledge, however reluctantly, that slavery was odious, even as the British Empire continued to profit from enslaving millions. Here was a legal decision celebrated as establishing freedom even as it was systematically ignored in practice. These contradictions help us understand how slavery persisted for so long, despite growing recognition of its fundamental injustice. James Somerset was born free, was stolen from his home as a child, spent more than 20 years in bondage, escaped, fought for his freedom in court, and won. And then he disappeared into the same obscurity that was the fate of millions of other victims of slavery. We remember his name because his case made legal history, but we should remember him as a human being, someone who loved and suffered, who experienced joy and terror, who made the terrifying choice to risk everything for freedom. We should remember that he was one man among millions, that his story of capture and enslavement was repeated across the Atlantic world on an almost incomprehensible scale. 3 million enslaved Africans were transported in British ships alone. Each one had a life story. Each one was someone's child. Each one experienced the horror of capture, the nightmare of the Middle Passage, the brutality of enslavement. Most of their names are lost to history. James Somerset's name survived because his case became famous, but that makes him an exception, not a representative. When we think about Somerset's legacy, we need to hold multiple truths in tension. His case established an important legal principle that helped the abolitionist cause, and his case was immediately violated and ignored in practice. His victory inspired other enslaved people to claim their freedom, and his victory left the vast majority of enslaved people exactly where they were. The Somerset decision represented a crack in slavery's legal foundation, and slavery continued for more than 60 years after his case in British territories, and even longer elsewhere. There's a temptation to see history as a straight line of progress, to imagine that Somerset's case was a key moment on an inevitable path toward emancipation. But history doesn't work that way. Progress, when it happens, is contested, incomplete, and reversible. The Somerset case helped change the debate about slavery, but it didn't end slavery. That took decades more work by thousands of activists, by enslaved people who resisted and escaped, by abolitionists who organized and campaigned, by people who challenged the economic and political systems that sustained slavery. We should also remember that ending slavery in the British Empire didn't end racism or inequality. The structures of racial hierarchy that slavery created persisted long after formal emancipation. The economic systems that enriched Europe and impoverished Africa continued. The ideologies that justified treating black people as inferior remained powerful. In many ways, we're still living with slavery's legacy, still struggling with the inequalities and injustices it created. So, what do we take from James Somerset's story? Maybe it's this: one person's courage can matter, even in the face of enormous systems of oppression. Somerset's decision to escape, to claim his freedom, forced the most powerful court in the British Empire to confront slavery's legal status. That mattered. But individual courage isn't enough. Somerset needed allies. He needed godparents who would fight for him, lawyers who would represent him, a growing abolitionist movement that had created the political space for his case to be heard. Freedom is both individual and collective. It requires personal courage and organized solidarity. Somerset's story also reminds us that legal victories, while important, are always incomplete if they're not accompanied by broader social and economic change. The Somerset decision didn't automatically free anyone. It created a precedent that had to be defended, applied, and extended through ongoing struggle. Rights that exist only on paper aren't really rights at all. They have to be claimed, enforced, and protected. The gap between Somerset's legal victory and the reality that slavery continued in England for decades afterward shows us that changing laws is only the beginning of changing society. And finally, Somerset's story reminds us of all the stories we don't know. We know his name because his case became famous, but what about the thousands of other black people in Georgian England whose struggles never made it to court? What about the millions of enslaved people whose resistance took other forms, who didn't win legal victories, but who maintained their humanity and fought for whatever freedom they could carve out? Their stories matter just as much, even though history has largely forgotten them. James Somerset walked free from Westminster Hall on June 22, 1772, and then walked into obscurity. We remember the court case, but not the man. We celebrate the legal principle, but we've forgotten what happened to the human being at its center. Maybe that's fitting, in a way. Somerset didn't fight for his freedom so he could become a historical symbol. He fought because he wanted to live as a free man in whatever obscurity or comfort that freedom might bring. He wanted what all of us want, to belong to himself, to make his own choices, to not be anyone's property. For a little while he got that. We can hope he got to enjoy it.